troubling and problematic project in the sense that there's some version of presumption involved in even trying to write either of them. Each one tries to engage someone else's voice essentially by trying to enter into it. And so I think there are a lot of, for both of them, there are questions to be asked, and you're right, in time, well, the decision may be against both books, but...
You've just created a segue here into translation.
Yeah.
So essentially, all reading is an act of translation, all writing is an act of translation, all co-optation of voice is an act of translation.
Right.
And not only are you a translator, but particularly in these two books perhaps, and many more, Lines of Inquiry, where you continue with collage work, and then First Fire, then Birds, as your own work, selected work, you end up rewriting your own work. As opposed to the traditional way of saying, I only want two poems from the first book, 10 from the second, two-thirds of the third, or whatever. And then whatever you did with that, you ended up writing it as a new book in a way.
Right.
And so, this notion of voice, translation, co-optation, in the art, which for me, and we talked about this recently, leads to this very problematic, and I think that we're deluded in the public space in talking about it, to these problematic notions of originality, and authenticity, which I think are both false notions, that in order to propel a market economy, as you said, a criterion for excellence or for success, we push so much on each other and the audience, those who love poetry and are incapable of writing a word. The notion of this is an original voice and this is an authentic thought. This is an original American voice or an authentic American, or this is an original immigrant voice or immigrant voice, and this is an authentic exilic something or the other, and so forth. And I was just wondering if you can talk about that, because I think the reproduction of so much hackneyed stuff, not to disregard it, as you say, you want to remain connected to a human past, not to pretend that we're in some sort of constant evolution. But
makes it intimate.
It's the glare of the.
Oh, there you go.
How do you see that in your own work? Since you're basically your own iconoclast. Maybe if I can bring it up from this angle.
Yeah, no, it seems to me connected to what you were just speaking of just a moment ago about the construction of identity, that we're surely all of us engaged in some form of identity construction, that we, at least it seems to me to be, if not self-evident, at least a good case could be made for its being a valuable.
Would the door bring any more circulation in the air or something? You open more, make it work.
Front row is designated as the official fans.
No, we're good. But yeah.
You got a lot of fans.
Girls.
But yeah, so I think we're constructing identity, and so remaining alive and remaining engaged with language in such a way that, yes, we're manipulating and changing language as poets, but I hope also being manipulated and changed by it. And so I hope that my relationship to other people's poetry and my relationship to my own poetry, I hope will continue to change over time. And I also would want to, we often talk in class, we often talk, and from conversation before we began, that there are at least a few teachers in the room of various, different college, high school, so on. And one of the things that we do very early on in talking about poems and talking about literature in general is to distinguish between the speaker and the writer in a poem. And so we're very careful to talk about the speaker in Keats's ode and not assume that it's Keats himself any more than we assume Hamlet's Shakespeare. But that word speaker assumes that the fundamental activity of the poet or of the voice is the putting out. And I want to suggest that a poet might also be a listener, that the act might have more to do with listening than with the speaking. That in other words, the origin of the poem might not be in the poet's head. It all started in the poet's head. I woke up and I'm Coleridge after my laudanum-induced sleep, and I wake up with Kubla Khan. That was, it was in my head. That's where it started. Maybe it starts in other voices, and maybe it starts in language that we're hearing elsewhere, and maybe it starts in people who are other than ourselves, and so on. And we receive it first before it comes out then as the voice.
I'd like to, see if maybe bring other people in, and so maybe we're not. After a while, I may just start talking to Harvey like we're on a train ride, and so I want to see. And if anybody wants to comment or have any questions, from your own experience as writers and readers of poetry about maybe some of the points that we've discussed.
Just people.
I'm interested in what you just said about listening to the poem. Can you just elaborate a little more? I mean, do you feel that your poetry is coming from an outside source and you have to be open to it and listen and transcribe correctly, or I just want to hear more about that.
Right. Yes, I do have that sense. There's a kind of famous passage in the British poet William Wordsworth wrote a preface to one of his collections of lyrical ballads that often gets quoted, or at least when I was in college, it was considered a kind of canonical, a very important canonical text. It may or may not be taught that way nowadays. But he talked about poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility. And that's a very widely sort of adopted notion. So we think of, poets. Poets are people who feel things very intensely, have deep emotions, and who like to withdraw into quiet places with their beanies and pipes and however they do their thing. But to recall these feelings of emotion and peaceful, and to record those feelings, which is fine. I got nothing against that, but it doesn't seem to me to exhaust the possibilities for poetry. And my own poetry, though it connects very closely with my own feelings and experiences and so on, it doesn't originate there. It starts in things I've read or overheard, or people I've met and been friends with, or whatever. It starts somewhere else outside of me, and it starts as an act of either literal or metaphorical listening. So it can be a very literal listening. So Anis very, very sweetly talked about a set of love poems in one of the books, and one of the titles of one of those love poems is a direct quotation from an overheard cell phone conversation, and so it's just pulled as the kind of starting point, which then becomes connected to something else. So I feel more like a witness a compositor, a collator, a curator of a curator of language. That what I hear. The philosopher Levinas talks about our being the face as a kind of, we are put into, like it or not, we're put into an ethical relationship simply by face to face, by the fact that you have a human face and I have a human face, and we incur obligation from that fact. And it seems to me that I incur obligation by the fact of living in a world of language, living in a world in which the medium of our communication with one another in language, to me it feels as though an obligation is imposed on me by that fact. And so I understand my poetry, rightly or wrongly, I understand my poetry as an attempt to live up to that obligation, to fulfill that obligation.
What in this context of connecting feeling with poetry, and I believe Fady will help me with that. You know, in Arabic, the word for poetry is the same word for to feel and to sense something, which is the poet is essentially the one who receives voices, he receives ideas, and then he generates them again. I think Fady can help me with that.
One who sense, yeah. Is one who, yeah. A sensor is a, you know, a feeler or a sensor, yeah.
Right. And journaling is great for that because I record so many things that I hear and see. I'm a high school teacher, and I have a journal constantly. Write things down. I don't always turn into poems. I have, and I have a lot. Even listening to NPR, you can get
Sure.
Just interesting side stories to start you out. And I will hear things, and I will record the things that I hear, and leave them in the journal. And then later, other things happen, and several different things happen, and then it goes into a poem. Just the voice, but I let it sit a while. But I want to record it. I want to record everything that I hear and see, even sitting in a restaurant sometimes.
It's an act of listening, basically.
Listening and recording what you see, and I think that's what a poet should be doing.
It's also the idea that the poem's always been a public record.
Yes.
And not the notion, so the idea of originality or authenticity, it belongs to a public record. And that the notion of originality or authenticity is suspect on an individual level, which is what we're obsessed with, always wanting this extreme individuation as the extreme or the epitome, you know, of extreme example or epitome of what an artist, what a grand artist is.
And I love this, Latif, the observation about the Arabic word, because it seems to me to make an easy connection with other kinds of metaphors. If the poet is the censor, the acutely trained, highly attuned censor, it seems to me to connect easily with, for instance, the kinds of instruments that we use to aid our, I don't see you as well now as I do now. And so something is happening here to enable me to see other than and better than I could see otherwise. The camera allows me to see something. It puts things into focus. I'm thinking of the huge telescopes that are just what's the one in New Mexico it's like lots of things all spread out across miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. And they're all ways of allowing us to see things that they're there,
Like
they're going on.
A veil has been lifted.
Exactly.
Where there's an element of discernment. Sometimes we have a discernment and sometimes we don't. And there's like a veil lifted from our eyes. And you get in. Sometimes the best thing to do is just record.
You wanted to read a poem. We were talking earlier, and you said you had an idea of reading a poem in